Here with us this morning. This would be the best place in the world to leave from. Amen. So where are you going? Up. And a shout. We've been waiting for 2,000 years for it. Now, we don't have to wait near as long as the generation before us. Father, Lord, give me the gift of teaching this morning. And then, Father, I pray you'd give the folks ears to hear and a heart that desires to know. You tell us that our people are destroyed for lack of knowledge in Hosea. Heavenly Father, I pray for the Spirit, Lord, of learning to come in here this morning. Help us as we open the Bible. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, the book of Genesis, Bereshith in Hebrew, that means in the beginning, or the book of beginnings. Genesis chapter number 6, verse number 4. It says, there were giants in the earth in those days. Those days, direct reference to the time before the flood. And what flood are you talking about? We're talking about the universal flood. When I say universal, I'm talking about a flood that covered Mount Everest, 29,000, whatever it is. Anybody know exactly what Everest is? It's 29,000 plus. And it covered it. No place on earth uncovered.
The Bible says it covered it by 15 cubits.
15 cubits?
That's the height of most giants at that time.
That's a good point. That's a good point. That's a good point. What he just said was that it covered it enough to make sure that no giant could stand on top of Everest and hold his head above the water. So it covered the entire earth. And I'm going to deal with that in a few moments. The ample proof of some kind of a cataclysmic event that came on earth. Now, last week we gave you some information about the giants. I talked about Lovelock Cave, and I quoted what a young Indian lady had to say about that, the tradition handed down among the Hopi people, H-O-P-I, one of the many tribes of North America, where she talks about the giants, the red-headed giants that were captured inside that cave. And now, of course, they made fun of them for generations. And then when they started removing the bat dung and got down low enough, they found all these huge skulls that belonged to giants. Wild Bill Cody, or Bill Cody, you remember him, Buffalo Bill. You remember that back in the early 1900s, he took a tour around the country, and I think he even went to Europe, and he had Wild West show. But in any event, the Indians told him about a race of giants so large in North America that they could capture a running buffalo. In other words, a giant big enough to reach down and pick up a buffalo and outrun the buffalo, obviously, catch it, and then take off with it. Now, we're talking about something that none of us have ever seen, and we've never read about in any of our history books. But that, of course, would agree with the fact that we know there's many proofs to huge beings on this earth. For example, I ran into this a couple of days ago, and this was posted on the internet, and I wanted to show you this. These are newspaper clippings, most of them from the New York Times. And you know what the New York Times styles itself as? The newspaper of record. In plainer words, if it happened, if it's fit to print, we've got it. That's what the New York Times says. And these giants, time and time again, especially in the 1800s and early 1900s, they record newspaper article after newspaper article after newspaper article after newspaper article about giants that have been found, their skeletons and artifacts found with the giants, directly proportioned to the size of the giant. In plainer words, a spear that I would carry would be a toothpick compared to what a giant would have, and an axe or a mallet or something of that nature, which is much larger than what I'm 6'3". I'm a runt compared to what we're talking about, over 20 feet tall. Many of these creatures, huge in size compared to a normal man. And as the Bible said, the rocks would cry out, and they have. And this is indisputable evidence. You have to deal with it. Did these creatures exist? They certainly did. No question about it. And so continue with the New York Times and other newspapers. Here's one: Beats Giant's Skull Unearthed by WPA Workers Near Victoria. What's a WPA worker? Anybody know?
The work program.
Works Project Administration, yeah, under Roosevelt. So this happened back in the 40s. And Roosevelt implemented this in the 30s. And one of the reasons he did is because of this horrible depression this country was going through. And Franklin Roosevelt instituted a lot of things. One of them was Works Project. This over here at Fountain City Park, if you'll look right there at this creek running in front of it, down next to the building, about 8-10 feet from the building down there at that creek, Fountain City Park, you'll see engraved in stone WPA. That was done in 1940s. Out there where I live, in the area where I live, there's a bridge that crosses the creek out there. And I just noticed this a couple of years ago. I was just looking as I went down through there, and I noticed WPA. That bridge was built by Franklin Roosevelt's workers in that time. But anyway, over and over and over again, we have newspaper accounts of giants, which immediately brings us to the question: well, why not people? Why don't they know something about it? What's going on? Why all of this? Why all this secrecy? Since we have the New York Times printing articles about giants, why don't we know more about them today? And the reason you don't is because of a orchestrated cover-up. And that cover-up is associated directly with the Smithsonian Institution, which, if the New York Times is the paper of record, then the Smithsonian is the museum of record of the archaeological discoveries in the United States and historical events in this country. I was in there one time, and the thing that stuck with my mind the most of anything that I saw at the Smithsonian was the Spirit of St. Louis. How many of you remember what that was? Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, and he barely made it across the treetops. I've watched the old footage of that. He barely made it, and the reason, of course, is because he was laden with fuel, and he couldn't climb but so fast. I had that happen to me one time. I jumped in a plane with a guy. We took off, and it was hot, and when we took off, hot weather, you don't have the lift in hot weather you do in cold weather. Vast difference. We took off. I'm a big 200-pounder. He's a big 200-pounder, and I'm in a Cessna 150, and I started pulling back on the yoke, and I thought, uh-oh, we're not going up. But we'd already left the ground. So I had to do something. And what you do as a pilot, you got to maintain airspeed. You've got to maintain airspeed. If you don't maintain airspeed, you start going down. But I had to climb above the trees over there across the river from me. And so I had to play a juggling game, boy. I mean, I learned my lesson real fast. We just barely cleared the trees. He was over there having a big time, talking, carrying on, didn't have an idea, didn't have a clue what was going on. And I'm sweating blood because I knew what could happen. But anyway, we cleared it. If it had been 20 degrees outside, no sweat. We would have lifted off, gone across the top of the trees, and away we would have gone. Last week I told you about Abraham Lincoln, and I told you about George Washington. I told you about Abraham Lincoln when he went to Niagara Falls. At Niagara Falls, he wrote a poem later about Niagara Falls, how that the giants of North America had at one time viewed Niagara Falls because they had been there so long. So obviously, our president, the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, believed in giants. And George Washington, when he was building Fort Loudon, I think this is up in Virginia in the French and Indian Wars, he dug up the ground to lay the foundation. And in the process of doing that, he dug into these huge bones from giants. And so we have two American presidents, both of them greatly respected, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, that attest to the giants. And both of them are made fun of, by the way. If all you have to do is a little reading today, and they'll say that Abraham Lincoln was completely duped because all he knew was what he'd been reading and had no idea what he was talking about. Anything but to accept the facts, because they don't fit this evolutionary humanistic philosophy that people live by and sadly die by today. The Smithsonian is definitely covering up. There's no question about it. Something has happened that does not fit their model of how North America was settled. And because of that, they just move it aside. And it has been alleged that they took a flat carrier, what do you call them, where they just haul coal and stuff, a barge out into the Atlantic, loaded with a lot of these artifacts, and just dumped them into the ocean. And because it was too condemning, it condemned their philosophy and so-called science. Evolution is a fool's paradise. No question about it. We talked last week about the discovery in Mexico of all of these artifacts. In 1944, a 69-year-old German merchant and amateur archaeologist, Waldemar Julsrud, discovered this. And what he found in Mexico was thousands of little artifacts of dinosaurs and men together. Doesn't fit the model, doesn't fit the time span, it doesn't fit the chronology of the way this thing was supposed to have developed. So what do? They say it's a hoax. They just push it aside. They just dismiss it like that and call it a hoax. And yet he called in some of the greatest minds in the world, in that area, and they authenticated it. But that's, to no avail. They just push it aside and call it a hoax. If it doesn't fit the model, if it doesn't fit the old boys club, then they get rid of it. Now I'm going to talk about Noah's Ark today, and not so much about the ark itself, but about the flood that the ark was built for. I believe in a universal flood. I believe in it. I believe the earth was covered with water from one end to from all the way around the globe. And let me start with this for you this morning. I know you've heard this in here before, but some of you might not have. You know that the Chinese culture is an ancient culture. It's been around a long time. China's been over there a long time. They use glyphs, like a hieroglyph. What do you call these things? The symbols, elements of symbols that they use. You've seen Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and all the rest of them. Well, each one of these little symbols has a meaning to it, and right, it's not a cursive writing like we do. It's just a symbol, but it has a meaning. All of them do. But they have some symbols, and here's what they mean. They put them together. They find them together. And here's what they mean when they put them together, and they're together all the time. A vessel plus 8 plus mouth or people equals boat. A vessel with 8 people, on it, in China, talking about how that this thing went across a flood. Now, where'd they get that from? They didn't get it from the New York Times, believe me. It was old before the New York Times was ever founded. Where'd they get it from? They got it from an ancient knowledge. They're at the plains of Shinar when they went out, right? The accounts of the flood are all over the world, folks. All over the world. The accounts of universal flood are to be found practically in every civilization on the face of the earth. Let me read some of this for you. Since Noah's Ark landed in the mountains of Ararat, it is not surprising that Noah's progeny migrated down the new Tigris River Valley from the mountains to find the earliest post-flood civilizations such as Sumer, Akkad, Uruk, Nimrud, which later became Babylon, Haran, Jericho, Sidon, Phoenicia, and more distantly Egypt and the Indus Valley of northwest India. The President of the United States has just sent fighter bombers into Iraq to strike ISIS, and especially particularly at Mount Sinjar. Tens of thousands of people are stranded on top of that mountain. And these murderers, these butchers, these are some of the most barbaric people that you have ever read about in your lifetime. Because of international pressure, is sending his strike force in there to do something about this. Folks, this is what's called the cradle of civilization. The cradle of civilization is like a fertile crescent. It's like a crescent. And Abraham came out of that area, which was called at that time Ur of the Chaldees. And it's the Fertile Crescent. And God removed Abram from there. He was Abram at the time. He removed him from there to take him into the promised land, into a land that he would show him. Then later changed his name to Abraham. But this is the Fertile Crescent. It's called the cradle of civilization because it is there that all of a sudden, now this is important, all of a sudden these cultures emerge. They're just there. And they can't find any steps leading up to it. It's just all of a sudden, here they are. And of course, the reason they are there all of a sudden is because, as our brother said a moment ago, they came off of Mount Ararat. They migrated through the plains of Shinar. They went down into what's present-day Iraq at the Tigris and Euphrates River. And it was there that civilization was birthed, that it moved forward to expand across the face of the earth. So it's just logical and stands to reason that if you're going to dig back into the origins of things, that's where you want to go. You want to go into what's called the cradle of civilization. It's an amazing thing here in 2014 that we've come full circle. Because here we are now back at the very spot where it all started. Don't you think that's remarkable? We're back where it started. And that's where it all started. And God called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees. He didn't tell him to stay there and convert the place. He took him out of that place. And that's very important to understand. But in any event, the stories of the flood, therefore, are all over the place. That place is saturated. The people that live in that area, they're saturated with the stories of a universal flood. Rightly so, because they're the ones who came down off of Mount Ararat and they went into this area and they settled it, and their descendants now, from thousands of years later, are living in that area. This area is so rich, so full of history, that it's unbelievable at the things that you begin to learn when you study them and you talk to these people, and you begin to realize that they have a knowledge that they could have only gotten from an experience that had happened to them a long time ago. Now, this is where Nimrod, this is where Babylon, this is where all of these people lived, and these locations are fixed for us. This is where the ziggurats are located. And the ziggurat, a lot of people compare with the Tower of Babel. We're not exactly sure what the Tower of Babel looked like. Nobody can give you a definite idea of what it looks like. But it's all located in this area. And here we have story after story after story of universal flood. James Nieuwhuis, Nienhuis, has a good bit of information available. Also, Legends of the Flood by Eric Lyons and Kyle Butt. But over a century ago, the famous Canadian geologist Sir William Lawson wrote about how the record of the flood is preserved in some of the oldest historical documents of several distinct races of men, and is indirectly corroborated by the whole tenure of the early history of most of the civilized races. Legends have been reported from nations such as China, Babylon, Mexico, Egypt, Sudan, Syria, Persia, India, Norway, Wales, Ireland, Indonesia, Romania, etc., composing a list that could go on for many pages. Although the vast number of such legends is surprising, the similarity between much of their content is equally amazing. James Perloff noted, in 95% of the more than 200 flood legends, the flood was worldwide. In 88%, a certain family was favored. In 70%, survival was by means of a boat. In 67%, animals were also saved. In 66%, the flood was due to the wickedness of man. In 66%, the survivors had been forewarned. In 57%, they ended up on a mountain. In 35%, birds were sent out from the boat, and in 9%, exactly 8 people were spared. That just doesn't happen, folks. The American Indians have legends about a universal flood. The ancient Greek mythology has legends about a universal flood. As I just read to you a moment ago, the Chinese and Asian legends, ancient Babylonian mythology. Be careful when they use the word myth. They like to use the word myth. They love to throw that word around. If it doesn't belong to the good old boys school, then it's a myth. And of course, the book of Genesis is a myth. Adam and Eve are myths. The flood is a myth, and Christ was a myth. Salvation's a myth. Heaven and hell's a myth. The list goes on and on and on with these people. I believe the Bible. I believe the Bible. And it's a remarkable thing. Now, here are some things that you'd be amazed at how they support the idea of a flood. Now, you've all heard of the mammoths, haven't you? The huge elephant, the woolly mammoth. They had all this hair on them. The standard model is that they lived in a very cold, frozen climate, and that through a period of time they all died out. They have found many of the mammoth bodies, not skeletons, bodies, the whole body intact. They have found this in Siberia. As a matter of fact, one estimate is that there are anywhere from 5 million or more mammoths buried in that area of Siberia and around the world, in that northern part of the climate. But what's remarkable about these mammoths is when they find them, they don't find them lying on their side where they had been killed or died from something. They find them standing up. Now, think about that for a minute. They find them standing up. They find them with vegetation in their bellies that hasn't eroded. In plainer words, whatever happened to this creature happened so quickly that its body was preserved, and the contents, they've even found them with vegetation in their mouth. So some kind of a cataclysmic event took place that literally came down upon these huge creatures and locked them in time. Locked them in time. Now, the gradual flow of the ice age and the ice coming down, this and that, and blah, blah, that's not going to do that. That's not going to work. You have to figure something else out. So these huge creatures are locked in time. It's almost as if the Lord God, when He did this, made certain that when men started digging into the ground, then sometimes they don't even have to dig into the ground. Sometimes the frost of the melting, in the springtime, will reveal creatures. For example, in the 1800s, these men were, I think they were whalers or whatever they were, fishermen of some kind. They were in this boat and they were up in Siberia, and it was in the thawing time of the year. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, emerging before their very eyes is this mammoth standing in a river. Standing in a river. Here's the water flowing by it. Here stands this mammoth. And they look at this thing, and it looks like it's alive. Its eyes are wide open, fixed, staring straight ahead. And they think to themselves, now what's going on here? But as they get closer, they realize that this thing's dead. So how could it be standing in the middle of this river and it dead? Then they find out that it is anchored to the ground, under the riverbed, frozen there, and has been for thousands of years. They check it out, what time they have to do. They check it out, they find the same thing. They find the food in its mouth, they find the food in its belly. Here is a creature standing there that had something happen to it so quickly that it just stopped it where it was and froze it in time. And then they said that as it continued to thaw, that this thing eventually came loose. And by the force and the torrent of the river, it carried it on out into the ocean, and it was never seen again. Now, you can believe these men, or you can call them liars, that it actually happened. And that's not an isolated case. They have found mammoths all over the place, full body, with vegetation in their stomach and in their mouths, standing up as if something from above all of a sudden locked them where they were. In plainer words, what happened at the flood happened so quickly in places that the animals couldn't even get away from it. Now, here's a remarkable thing. I thought this was very interesting. You can't see this, of course, but these are the tusks from a mammoth. You know, the tusk are the huge things that come out like this. And by the way, that's another point to make too, and here it shows a picture of these on this riverbank, that if a tusk is left out and exposed any period of time, it begins to degenerate, and it begins to crack, and you know, it just wastes away. But these tusks that they're finding are perfectly preserved, frozen, you know, fast frozen, and as if they were grown yesterday. But they found this on some of them. This is quite a thing. What do I do with it? Here it is. A mammoth tusk markings. Peppered mammoth tusk. Scientists are finding over wide geographical areas, mammoth tusk embedded on one side with millimeter-size particles rich in iron and nickel. The BBC, British Broadcasting, stated, quote, "Startling evidence has been found which shows mammoth and other great beasts from the last ice age were blasted with material that came from space." Throw the ice age junk out. Something happened that brought something down from above with such force that it drove it into the tusk of these mammoths and embedded itself there and stayed there and still there. And when they're finding it, they're finding that these creatures died an instant death. Now here's a graphic of these men in the ship. This is 1800s, a steamer, and it's got that wheel on the side of it. And it shows this mammoth in the water. And I know you can't see that, it's so far away. But after this is over with this morning, you can come up here and I'll leave all these notes and you can look at the stuff that I've got and think that this is quite a remarkable thing. So why is it? It's remarkable because of the way it happened. The way it happened. This is not a gradual thing. This is an instantaneous thing. Something just absolutely overwhelmed these creatures and locked them in time. And the only thing that's ever happened to this earth that absolutely affected the whole earth was a universal flood. And the flood was in the time of Noah. Yes, sir.
Like water hydraulics, when the fountains of the earth opened up.
Yes, sir. That's a big one right there.
It just exploded out.
It did.
I think you bring a lot of canyons and everything to see. There was a lot more water around.
That's where I'm headed. Exactly. You've been doing some reading on this stuff, but it did. Why, sure. When the fountains of the deep were broken, right? And we haven't seen any fountains of the deep break up lately, although we've seen there's a what's that trench called out there? The fault out there in California. The fault in California, San Andreas Fault, and then we've got one that's there's a fault out here in between Tennessee and Kentucky too. Madrid Fault. These places are hot spots for earthquakes, you know, and that's why they're watching them closely, and they're saying that we're in for a big one. Now, how many of you know what muck is? Muck. All right, listen to this. All right. Now, I'm just picking up in the middle of a statement here, but you'll catch on. Finally, their bodies were buried and protected from predators, including birds and insects. But burial could not have occurred if the ground were frozen as it is today. Exactly. In other words, if the ground is hard frozen, you're not going to push this creature into it, see. Again, this implies a major climate change. But now we can see that it must have changed suddenly. How were these huge animals quickly frozen and buried? Almost exclusively in muck, a dark soil containing decomposed animal and vegetable matter. Muck is a major geological mystery. It covers 1/7 of the Earth's land surface, all surrounding the Arctic Ocean. Muck occupies treeless, generally flat terrain with no surrounding mountains from which the muck could have eroded. Russian geologists have in some places drilled through 4,000 feet of muck without hitting solid rock. Now we're talking about nearly a mile, folks. Where did so much eroded material come from? Oil prospectors drilling through Alaskan muck have brought up an 18-inch long chunk of tree trunk from almost 1,000 feet below the surface. It wasn't petrified, it was frozen. The nearest forests are hundreds of miles away. Elsewhere, Williams, and this is the one I think who wrote the thing about there is no the non-energy crisis. If you do a little reading, you find out that you can produce oil under pressure in just a few hours. It doesn't take long. Oil. You can produce it, and coal, it takes, I make think maybe a week or so or whatever it is. I don't know how long the period is, but you can produce coal too by pressure. Now, the very thing he's talking about, the fountains of the deep breaking up, this enormous pressure that is being applied, all of a sudden this huge pressure that's coming up on the earth could very easily produce a lot of things today that we simply try to make fit the model, and it doesn't fit the model. But listen to this. Here we go. Though the ground is frozen for 1,900 feet down from the surface at Prudhoe Bay, now we all know where that is. They built that pipeline down through Alaska. Everywhere the oil companies drilled around this area, they discovered an ancient tropical forest. Now, what in the world is that doing up there? It was in frozen state, not decomposed state, frozen state. Now, y'all getting this? I mean, let's put our thinking cap on for a minute. Let's get a hold of this for a second. A frozen state, a tropical forest. Now, when's the last time they had a freeze in Hawaii? They don't freeze, but it's frozen. But by doing that, by freezing like that, what it does, it seals it in time that this is not the way it has always been. Amen. Something happened that defies explanation if you don't believe in a universal flood, because no gradual move of anything did this. It's frozen. Now notice this. An ancient tropical forest in a frozen state, not petrified. It is between 1,100 and 1,700 feet deep. There are palm trees, pine trees, and tropical foliage in great profusion. In fact, they found them lapped all over each other, just as though they had fallen in that position. In plain words, the water was coming in, and then down comes the ice on top of them. How were these trees buried under 1,000 feet of hard frozen ground? We are faced with the same series of questions we first saw with the frozen mammoths. Again, we are driven to the conclusion that there was a sudden and dramatic change in climate, accompanied by a rapid burial in muck, now frozen solid. Now, folks, I'm no geologist, and you don't look to me for an authority on something like this. All I'm going to do is read to you what these folks have said by their research. And what you'd have to do is compare this material and check it out. And when I get up here and give out stuff like this and read stuff like this, I cannot attest 100% to the veracity of any of this. But what you can do is say, when you start pulling material here and material here and material here and material here, you see a consistency begin to develop. And by that, then you can understand there's something going on. You know, I may not understand all that's going on here, but something is happening. And so here's a question. How could a mammoth, a woolly mammoth, be frozen in time with the vegetation in its stomach? And much of that vegetation no longer grows in that area. See, it grows in the southern hemisphere, or southern part of the United States, where it's warmer. But here it is. Here it has been eating these things that's obvious that the climate was entirely different because of what's going on. But here it is inside this creature, and it had not decayed. It was fast frozen. How do we explain that? When you take the preponderance of the evidence, all that's out there, and you start pulling it together, you have to say to yourself, a bit here and a piece here, a piece of the puzzle here, and a piece here, and a piece here, and a piece here, and a piece here. This starts making sense if we believe that something remarkable happened to the earth that had never happened before. The flood of Noah. Now here's the thing. If you get it nailed down in your mind, and I hope we don't have anybody in here this morning that doesn't believe in the universal flood. I do. I believed it from day one because I was saved and I believed the Bible. Never had any problem with that. You know. But I've heard Christians, quote unquote Christians, down through the years who said, well, you know, that's a little bit hard to believe. It's a local flood, and I don't really believe that the children of Israel crossed over on dry ground and the Red Sea was parted. I believe they went across Yom Suf, the Sea of Reeds in the north, and blah, 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 blah. And you get all kinds of stuff like that. I've never had a problem believing in miracles and never had a problem believing the Bible. But if you believe the story of Noah's flood, it fixes something in your mind. It fixes something in your mind. It really does. Yes, sir.
There's a neighbor of mine that worked for Asarco, which is a mining company.
Uh-huh.
And up at the Forksy River, I guess it's USA now, but they've got some quarries up there. They're about 200 to 300 feet deep. And he brought home snail that is the size of cereal bowl from 200 and 300 feet down in solid rock.
Isn't that remarkable?
Hey, and I've seen it.
Right. Right.
I mean, just crustaceans buried in coal.
Uh-huh. Found a what now? A thimble?
A sewing thimble,
Buried in coal.
300 feet.
300 feet deep, a thimble buried in coal. You remember what I just said a few minutes ago about coal? How it can be formed in just a short period of time. There are those who say about this non-energy crisis, by the way, while we're talking about it, I'll mention this to you. You know, they talk about, what's that term for it? Oil. There's a term they use for oil being that there's only so much oil and you're going to run out of oil. And this is why the price is skyrocketing and you're paying so much for gasoline, because they've brainwashed you into believing that. There's a term for it. I wish I could think of it. But anyway, there are those also who believe that oil is being constantly formed right now, produced because of the immense pressure that's going on right now in the earth, and that oil is being produced, and that when they pump a place dry, they can go back later and find there's more oil in there. And things like that are happening. Yes, sir.
Since I've been reading the Bible, like you talked about the fountains opening up, I think at that time what I've been thinking is, because they found a lot of tropical stuff in the North, the oil, but I think there was the Lord made such a catastrophic thing that the earth could have shifted to, and
Well,
off its axis.
Exactly. And it did.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of there's not an agreement, put it that way. There's not an agreement, there's not a universal agreement as to how much it shifted, but it did shift. The earth shifted. The flood affected the axis of the earth.
Pressure produced cold. Low pressure produces cold too. That's why everything froze. Because, it was probably not just when they exploded. There was probably lots of different pressures and things that produce cool weather. Like you can't cool the earth like the Lord can cool the earth within a day. Drop it down 30 degrees. I mean, or
Yeah.
even 50 degrees. So low pressures and things that exploded might have produced ice cold to freeze.
Well, how many of you have read in the book of Genesis where it says in the days of Peleg, P-E-L-E-G, the earth was divided? Okay, you've read that. All right, there's a lot of different takes on what that means. But it says the earth was divided in the days of Peleg in the book of Genesis. And I can't take you to the chapter. I think it's chapter 10, 9, 10, somewhere in there. 10, the earth was divided in the days of Peleg. All right, there's a lot that this brother has mentioned this morning about hydraulics and about the pressure, about the plate of the earth, and about the shifting of continents, and about where they had joined together before, and all this stuff. There's a lot to deal with when you're talking about that. But the fact that it shifts or it moves can produce mountain ranges, can produce whole mountain ranges, or it can cut huge gorges like Grand Canyon. Stuff like that can happen practically overnight.
Cities are underwater.
Atlantis, that Plato talked about.
Different cities way down 30, 40 feet.
Yes, they have. There's a road down there in Bimini, and you can see it from the air. Water's clear. You can see it's called the Bimini Road. It's in the Caribbean. You can see the road, and of course, The deniers and who call everything a myth say that's not man-made. That's not a man-made structure. That's a natural. But here's this road going down through here, and I mean it's as plain as it can possibly be, but it's underwater. It's under the ocean. Now that, of course, is a different thing entirely, what our brother brought up, but it's very important. It's part of understanding what happened with the flood of Noah, a universal flood. Did it happen? Yes, it happened. You can be sure it happened. And you don't have to be intimidated by anybody from the National Geographic Society or the New York Times or whatever schools out there who tries to come along and tell you, no. You're just a redneck. You got your gods and your guns, and you got this and that and so forth. You know, you don't know what you're talking about. If you knew what we knew, why you wouldn't be making statements like that. Now, the Grand Canyon is a mystery. And I'm going to close with this. It's a mystery. Why is it a mystery? It's got caverns. It's got things cut. What do you call this? Where you got a door cut in the side of a cliff. Cut into it. Cavern. That's what I'd think. A cavern. It has caverns cut into the sides of the cliffs. Inside these caverns, you'll find a lot of things that don't match the isolationist theory of the Smithsonian. And you'll find a connection. The Indians, the Native Americans, the Indians have legends about Oriental people associated with these caverns that are cut into the side of the Grand Canyon. All right. Yes, sir.
There's a road up in Ohio, a paved road that no one knows where it came from or how, but it's miles and miles long. It goes across the state. There's a lot of strange things up in Ohio.
We got some strange stuff in Tennessee too, brother. Believe me.
Look up there and look at Serpent Mound, and some of these round mounds are huge. They used to find bodies up there all the time of giants. But there's still a lot of mounds up there that haven't even been broken into.
How many's ever seen a skull? Now, a skull. You know what a normal human skull looks like? All right. How many's ever seen a skull where the top of the skull goes back up like that and comes back down? All right. They have found hundreds of these in different places on the earth. Some of the areas in South America, I forget whether it's Peru or I think it's Peru, is concentrated the most, but they found them everywhere. These skulls. Yes, sir.
They found one oblong skull that fits no species, and the DNA says that it's not human, it's not any kind of animal that's ever been found on the earth. But it was a human type upright creature.
And so the anthropologist dismisses it. He says it's produced by binding. Binding, you know. Yes, sir.
What it boils down to is this. You don't believe scientists, so-called, falsely so-called science, or you don't believe the Word of God? After Civil War, freed slave pastor John Jasper preached a message out of
Yeah, he's quite a preacher, Jasper was.
He preached a message out of Isaiah 38 where the sun moved backwards. And he said the name of the message was The Sun Do Move. And he was absolutely crucified for believing that the sun moved backwards because everybody says the sun doesn't move, it's stationary. But he believed it, no matter how much pressure they put on him. And I thought about that for years. And you know what? I believe the sun moves. And if the Bible's...
Well, who upholds all things, brother? Word.
It's something the way we see it. There's something wrong. If God says it does it, it does it. Yep. And our understanding is wrong.
I belong to that school. Whether I understand it or not, I believe it.
They did computer studies, and they found that
Exactly. All right, we've run out of time. Next week, now I'm going to pick up again, but next week I'm going to bring in two bloodlines. Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth. We're going to talk about two bloodlines. It's very important to understand the progression of revelation, one side of God, the other side of Satan. And then we'll connect that with flood, what was before the flood and after the flood. How many in here this morning you believe there was a universal flood? Folks, I do. I believe the Bible. Don't ever let anybody flam you out of believing the Bible.
Amen.
Brother Wilson, you dismiss.
Father, we thank you, Lord, for this day. We thank you for your word, Lord. We thank you, Lord, that by your Spirit, by faith, that we know that the worlds were formed by your word, Lord. And Father, help us not to be sucked into the spirit of the age, Lord, that tries to use logic and analyze and pick apart and deny your word, Father. But God, help us to be like the saints of old, to cling to what the Word of God says, to stand on it, and to trust in you, Lord. Father, how can anybody profess to actually believe that you were a man crucified and a dead man was raised from the tomb to save humanity and not believe such a simple thing as you part the Red Sea? It's beyond me, Father. Help us never to fall for that. Help us to believe the Bible just as it's written, Lord. Help us to walk in the old paths. In Jesus' name, amen.